Hi there, I'm Joshua Horton, the lead historian of Clover High History Society. This is,
I'm Haley Thompson, and I'm the lead secretary.
and I'm here with Zach Lemhouse.
Hey, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Of course, no problem. We're going to be asking a series of questions based on your career and what you do a day-to-day basis. So let's begin. So, what first sparked your interest in history, and how did that evolve? Excuse me, to your career that you are at now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've always been interested in history. I think my love of history was probably sparked because of my dad. My dad was a history teacher. He taught eighth grade social studies here in the Clover School District. And so growing up, when we would go on vacations, they were always family vacations to historic sites. Maybe we went to Fort Moultrie or Fort Sumter in Charleston, historic Brattonsville here in York County. We were always going to different sites. We'd go out of the state sometimes. I remember going to like Williamsburg and Monticello and Montpelier in Virginia. Um, so it was always kind of part of my childhood. And early on, I knew I wanted to do a career in history. By the time I was in middle school, I knew I wanted to be a history teacher. And then after I went to school, I went to college and became certified to be a teacher. I taught for about 5 years and really enjoyed that. And then I had the opportunity to become a public historian and work with the museums in York County. Uh, and I hadn't looked back. It's been a great career path.
Yeah. And as a historian focused on South Carolina and York County, what lesser known events or figures do you think deserve more attention?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in the American Revolution, right? But it wasn't until I began working with the museums that I started researching and focusing on the Reconstruction time period. And if you're not familiar with the Reconstruction time period, it's that 12-year period after the American Civil War where people of color are getting more and more rights after they have been emancipated, right? And before I started my job, I had no idea that York County had such a important tie to the Reconstruction time period. We have racially motivated violence occurring in York County at very high levels. But you also have people of color that are standing up against that racial violence, risking their lives, and in some cases paying the ultimate price, getting killed for their activism fighting for civil rights. So I would hope that uh, I can teach people about these lesser known people. For example, people like there's a guy named Elias Hill who was a black preacher and teacher that lived here in York County. And he was formerly enslaved, so he had to teach himself to read, right? And he was born with a debilitating disease that left him unable to walk. So he would preach throughout York County, fighting for civil rights, um, overcoming his physical disabilities. He would actually go around on a spring wagon, right? A wagon that had springs on it, preaching throughout the community and condemning the violent acts of people trying to suppress black people like the Ku Klux Klan, right? So yeah, I'd want people to know the stories of these little known heroes that fought against racial violence, racism, white supremacy in York County.
So, how do you approach separating historical fact from myth, especially when with dealing with local legends or oral traditions?
So oral traditions are very important. Sometimes that's all we have, especially when it comes to the black community, right? And I think it's important for everyone to understand that when historians like myself do research in the archives to try to find those primary sources, there are silences that are in the archives, especially for the black community. And the reason those silences exist in the archives, uh, you have to think about, well, who's making these documents that are in the archives? And who's deciding what documents are worth preserving in the archives? And the answer to both those questions are white people, right? Because historically, people of color were not allowed to learn how to read, so they couldn't be literate. And if you can't read or write, you can't create your own documents that are then preserved in an archive, right? And historically, people of color have not been the ones that are preserving these documents, making decisions, well, what gets preserved in this archive? What is important enough to get preserved in these archives? So when I go into the archive, I'm not getting a lot of those Black stories. I'm not hearing that Black voice. It's been silenced. So that's where oral history comes in. Sometimes that's all we have. So what I will do is, if I'm interpreting oral history, I will typically just tell the person that this is according to family tradition or according to oral history, so people know where that source is coming from. And I think that's a good practice for any historian, regardless of what your source is. If you can cite your source when you're having a conversation with somebody, or writing it in an academic paper, or putting it in a museum exhibit on like a interpretive text panel, if you can say according to oral history, according to family tradition, that lets them know where that story is coming from, but that doesn't mean it's any less valid or any less accurate, right?
Yeah. What role do primary sources play in your research, and can you share a memorable discovery from the archives?
Yeah. So, like I said, there are those silences in the archives. So it's hard to get sometimes the Black voice. And a lot of my history is African American history. That's a lot of the history that I work with, and a lot of the history that I research and study and write about. So one of the most memorable finds was a pension application that was filed by an African American woman who was the widow of a Union soldier, a Black Union soldier named Jim Williams. And Jim Williams, kind of like Elias Hill, who we mentioned earlier, was a active civil rights leader in York County, fighting against racial violence, fighting against white supremacy during the Reconstruction time period. And Jim had escaped from slavery, and he joined the Union Army. And about 180,000 people of color, men, Black men, escaped from their plantations during the Civil War and joined the Union Army. So Jim was one of them. And he was murdered because of his activism by the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist terrorist organization that was very active here in York County. And when his wife went to apply for this pension as the widow of a Union soldier, she had to rely on testimony from people that knew her and knew her husband to attest to the fact that her husband had served in the Union Army. And this was a gold mine for finding information about Jim Williams and his wife. Rosa was her name. Because in this pension, they're describing what he looks like physically. They're describing his birth. There was a testimony from his aunt, so his mom's sister, who was describing his birth. And I got to find the names of his parents. You don't have that kind of information readily available for a lot of enslaved people when you're researching them and studying them. You just don't have that information. A lot of times the only sources you might have would be a bill of sale where someone is selling an enslaved person to somebody else. You might have a bill of sale, and that'll tell you their name. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it'll say Letty and 3 children. So I would never know those children's names, right? And then you get how much they were valued at by an enslaver, right? But with the exception of that, you really don't get a lot of information. And this pension application was just a gold mine of these very personal, intimate details to tell me who Jim Williams was as a person and who his wife was as a person. So I think that was probably one of the coolest finds that I've found recently.
So obviously, as you stated, throughout your career, you were a eighth grade teacher that taught South Carolina history.
Yep.
During that, how did you make history accessible and engaging for those younger audiences and students, and how do you still do it to this day?
Wow. Okay, that's a great question. I think making a story relevant is an important way to engage somebody. If you don't see why this is important or relevant in your life, then I'm not going to be able to engage you, right? So I would always strive to show my students and the public that I work with today why these stories are relevant to them in 2025, right? And one way to make something really relevant is to help people see themselves in that story, which is why it's so important to tell a diverse story. Um, you need to tell the story of people of color. You need to tell the story of women, right? And children and Native Americans. And when you're telling the American Revolution story, you can't just tell the patriot side. You got to talk about the loyalist side too. You've got to tell a diverse story so everyone has an opportunity to see themselves in that story.
Mm.
If you're only telling the story, for example, of a white man, anyone who is not a white man is going to have trouble seeing themselves in that story and relating to that story. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's probably the primary way that I would try to make things relatable when I was teaching my students, to try to tell as a diverse a story as possible so everyone could relate and see themselves in that story.
Yeah. In your opinion, how have the interpretations of South Carolina American Revolution and or the Civil War history changed over time?
Oh, how has the interpretation of those periods of history changed over time? That's a great question. Um, as far as the American Revolution is concerned, I have seen, going back to that diversity element, telling a story from multiple perspectives. I have seen an effort and a concerted effort to tell stories of, for example, loyalists, right? You've heard the expression that history is written by the winners, and for a very long time, the focus was on the patriot cause, right? And I have seen a shift, not away from telling the patriot story. Of course, we're still telling the patriot story, but a shift to try to incorporate more stories of the loyalists and the women and the Native Americans that served and the people of color that served on both sides of the conflict. Yeah, I mean, as far as other aspects of history, um, there's something in history called historiography. Historiography is the history of how we tell history, and it tracks just what you're asking, the development of how the telling of history has changed over the years, right? Um, and it's fascinating to study historiography because you really see. So, for example, with the Civil War um, and the Reconstruction time period, we're seeing a shift away from. Are you familiar with the term the lost cause? So there's this idea that was perpetuated immediately after the Civil War in the South, and it's called the lost cause. And historians today, most of the time, most historians agree that the lost cause is a myth. It's not real. It doesn't exist. And what the lost cause says is that it's this idea that during slavery, uh, you had a beautiful southern landscape populated by kind slave owners and happy and content slaves, right? And for a long time, now of course that's not true, right? Uh, that this idea, this landscape, this ideal, beautiful landscape with benevolent and slave owners and happy slaves, that didn't exist, right? Um, but for a long time, early on, and I'm talking immediately after the Civil War, the late 19th century, early 20th century, any histories of the Civil War perpetuated this lost cause myth. And you see it if you've ever watched Gone with the Wind, or if you're even familiar with the movie Gone with the Wind, that moonlight and magnolias kind of ideal environment during slavery. That's perpetuated in a lot of early histories. But then later on, we see that start to shift away to a more inclusive, accurate, thorough representation of of that history. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So if you study historiography, you do start to see these shifts over time of how we tell this history and how it changes.
So, what challenges do historians face when presenting complex or controversial topics to the public?
That's also a great question. Um, yeah, so the big one, going back to the Lost Cause, or things like the Lost Cause. Things like the Lost Cause are created by something called collective memory. And collective memory is uh, what we as a community have learned about something, and it's not always accurate, right? It's what we've been told about something. It's what we've come to believe about something. Collectively, how we remember things. And for a long time, going back to Lost Cause, some Southerners, as a group collectively, remembered slavery in the time before emancipation in one particular way, right? That very idealistic way. That was their collective memory. When you confront someone with information that is incongruous, so different, it goes directly against their collective memory of something, it causes something that one author calls a distortion in their mind. It can be very disorienting and frustrating, and a lot of times I've had people get mad at me before, because what I am presenting as history is different than their collective memory of the past. And a lot of times that causes this distortion, and it can make them very angry. So that's probably the biggest challenge that I have had. And it's important to understand that people that are experiencing this distortion, because the history I'm presenting is different than the history that they have been brought up learning, it's important for me to understand and give them grace, and to understand that this is what they have known and this is what they have learned, and it's difficult to unlearn things, right? So it is my hope that gradually over time, working with the public, we can shift thinking, right, to be a little more holistic. But I just have to be prepared as a public historian working with the public that sometimes I will run into people who are going to be frustrated because the history I'm presenting is not the history that they might have grown up with.
Yeah. And how do you incorporate geography, economics, or culture into your historical analysis of the region?
Wow. I mean, how to begin? I mean, geography is super important. I mean, if you're talking about something like the differences between the low country of South Carolina along the coast or the back country of South Carolina, that geographic or regional difference can mean everything. If it comes to motivations as to why people might have supported the Patriots during the Revolution or the Loyalists during the Revolution, that geographic difference could mean all the difference in the world as to what side they chose to fight for. I mean, economics is the same way. Generally speaking, if you were a wealthier elite person during the American Revolution or leading up to it, you had a vested interest in throwing off the shackles of British rule to govern yourself, right? They could make more money that way. So if you start thinking about economics and how that plays into historic events like the American Revolution, you get a whole different perspective. You see it from a whole different point of view, right? And what's your other one? You said geographics, economics, and culture. I mean, culture is a huge one. You start thinking about Black culture, the culture of enslaved people, versus the culture of white slave owners, right? What did a funeral for an enslaved person look like in their culture versus a funeral for a white person? What did a wedding look like for an enslaved person if they were allowed to have one, versus the wedding for an affluent white person, right? Bringing in these cultural aspects and considering culture uh, can really bring so much to your study of history, your interpretation of history, your understanding of history. So it can't be done in a vacuum. You do have to consider geography and economics and culture and gender. We didn't even talk about gender. You have to consider gender identities, racial identities. All of these things need to be considered in order to have this full understanding of history.
So, can you describe a moment when historical research changed your perspective on a modern issue?
Hmm. Historical research changed perspective on a modern issue. Um, I think that my research into the Reconstruction time period in the fight for the right for people to vote, people of color to vote, um, has really made me realize how important the vote is, um, and how we need to exercise that right to vote. It gives you a whole new appreciation when you start researching people struggling for these rights. Um, when you exercise those rights in 2025, you get a whole new appreciation. Not just the black right to vote, but later on when women get the right to vote, you get a whole new appreciation for it when you go out and do it in 2025. So yeah, I think that's probably the best answer.
And what advice would you give to aspiring historians who want to specialize in local or regional history?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Find your local history organizations. That could be a museum, like my museum, the Culture and Heritage Museums of York County. It could be a like maybe the Catawba Cultural Center, which is in Rock Hill. It could be your local library, the local York County Library. Find these history and culture institutions and visit them. I mean, go to the museum, go to the library, go to the Catawba Cultural Center, go to Kings Mountain National Park, go to Kings Mountain State Park, go to these places, these resources that you have in your own backyard, and just go and experience them. Then, if you're really interested, get to know the people that work there, network with them, let them know you're interested. They might have volunteer opportunities for you or internship opportunities. And uh, I did that before I had my job. I was volunteering with Kings Mountain State Park, with Culture and Heritage Museums, with Kings Mountain National Military Park. I was volunteering at these places, and they were getting to know me, and I was getting to learn um, how their institutions worked. I was getting that, not only learning the history, but learning the institutional knowledge, how their organizations worked, and that helped me in the field when I wanted to apply for a job because I had that experience working in the field. Um, and just explore your community, um, talk with people, um, get their stories because history does not have to be a dead thing. I just did a wonderful project with alumni of Jefferson High School in the city of York. Jefferson High School was the last, uh, was the only, excuse me, black high school for black students in the city of York during segregated schools, right? So that was their only option prior to integration. And we put up a historical marker recently for Jefferson High School, and I got to work with the alumni, people that remembered being in a segregated school, black people that remembered being in a segregated school, or remembered integrating into white schools, right? That history is there and it is alive. And while these people are still with us, uh, that can bring that history to life, talk to them. You mentioned oral histories earlier. That's a wonderful resource for historians. So something you can do now is record those oral histories, kind of like you're doing in this interview now. Sit down with people, get their stories, so that when they're no longer with us, that has been recorded for future historians, future generations to learn from.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to have this interview with you, Mr.
Wonderful.
Lemhouse, and thank you for
Yeah,
taking the
absolutely.
time to
I'm
come
happy to be
out.
here. Thank you.
And until next time with Clever History Society, we'll catch you later. I'll cut that extra out, but that was perfect. Well,
Yes,
thank you.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, you
That
think
was
that was good?
awesome. Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
And is this going to be available through